Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
Everyone, welcome to Podcast 83, the podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. Today, we're joined by Jared Walczak, who is the Vice President of State Projects at the Tax Foundation. Jared, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
No problem. So first, Jared, before we get into what we want to talk about, the report you guys just came out with, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Tax Foundation briefly?
Yeah, the Tax Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy organization, essentially a think tank. We work at the federal, state, and local, and even at the global level, helping to educate policymakers and the general public on tax policy, on the choices and the trade-offs. And we're trying to promote generally competitive pro-growth tax policy.
Well, great. Yeah, so it came to our attention that you guys had recently done a report on something that's popping its head up not only in Michigan, but I think in a lot of other states, and that's specifically a look at property tax reform and potentially the elimination of property taxes. I know it's been talked about in other states, it's being talked about in Michigan. Why don't you talk a little bit about that report and what some of the findings were when you start talking about eliminating property taxes, the impact, what are options to backfill, not backfill? Take it away.
Yeah, we've done a variety of publications on property taxes, arguing for what their place is in the overall system. But our latest paper is trying to fill what I think is an important gap, because a lot of the conversation around property tax elimination has really been half of a conversation. It's been essentially, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to pay property taxes, with very little grappling with, well, what's the alternative? And you can hear, oh, well, maybe we should cut spending, cut government waste, whatever the case may be. But the property tax is 70% of local tax revenue nationwide. In 18 states, it's more than 80%. We're way past the ability to say, we're just going to replace that with government efficiencies. It has to come from somewhere. So sometimes you get some hand waving. Maybe some of it can come from the state income tax, the state sales tax. Well, in Michigan, the property tax raises 40% more than the state income tax does. It raises 2/3 of the amount that the state income and sales tax combined raises. So what our paper is looking at is, what would it actually mean if proponents of these ideas aren't going to tell you what the trade-offs would be, what the pay-fors would be? We're going to run a variety of scenarios. We're going to say, what if you put it at a state income tax, a state sales tax, local level income or sales taxes? What would all of that look like? And I think for many people, it may be fairly undesirable.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of those different alternatives here in a minute, because some of them don't really work for us. We don't have a local option sales tax, at least at the county level. Obviously, we're more focused on the county level than other municipalities, but I think it's a good general conversation to have. So let's talk about some of those alternatives. When you start looking at income tax, state sales tax, other local option taxes, whether it be sales tax or whatever. Let's first focus on, I guess, the income tax. What would it mean if you just said, hey, we're going to go to an income tax, assuming, of course, you do want to backfill the local governments? Because, of course, like you said, there are people out there that would just say, well, get tighter, tighten the belt. That's what we have to do at home, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And again, I think you have to find a revenue alternative, even if you're someone out there who thinks government's too big. It's not that much bigger. It's not at the point where you could possibly just forego property tax revenue without replacing it. You have to find that replacement. So for an income tax, if you're thinking Michigan, you have to think about essentially getting an 11 to 12%, almost a 12% all-in state income tax rate to offset this property tax elimination. So when you're thinking about income taxes, we need to think about what the trade-offs there are. Every tax has its pros and cons. Income taxes have a different distributional analysis than property taxes, and some people like that. But they also have more of an adverse effect on job creation, on location decisions, on investment, on economic growth. So you don't want to put all of your eggs in that basket. I don't think Michigan wants a 12% income tax. And we're talking flat income tax, by the way. If you wanted that graduated, then the top rate would have to be way higher than 12%. So this would be everyone paying 12% on all of their income. And then you have the challenges. How do you give that back to those jurisdictions? Right now, of course, we have assessments. The property tax is raised and it's based on assessed value. If we don't have a property tax, there's no assessments anymore. How do you determine how that goes back? Whatever formula you choose is going to have winners and losers. If you just do it by population, some places that are higher cost, maybe higher income, higher service, suddenly get way less revenue. And what do? Now they can't really compensate in some other way. If you just replace based on prior year's collections and maybe adjust that for the future, well, now you're rewarding the jurisdictions that have the highest tax in the future. And you might have a jurisdiction, maybe it's an affluent community that said, we want higher taxes because we care about the higher services, the greater quality of services. We're willing to pay for that. It's really hard to go back to the rest of the state, though, and say, hey, that jurisdiction gets more revenue and higher quality services in perpetuity, but they're not paying any more in taxes anymore. They're paying the same amount as you are. How do you go to someone and ask them to subsidize that when they can't actually generate the revenue for themselves? Some other approaches to this sort of freeze it in place exactly. So if your community grows, you get more businesses, more individuals. Now each dollar has to spread, like it spreads thinner. So what does that tell you to do? It tells you to shrink. That the only way that you can prosper is by losing residents and losing businesses. None of these to me sound like attractive options.
Yeah, and the key point there is local control, right? That local
Yeah.
control option goes away as well when you're leaving it up to the state to distribute, or however that looks. It's a statewide tax that kind of gets distributed by the state elected officials rather than your local elected officials that you can keep in contact with.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about sales tax. That's another option you guys looked at. How would that look like if you decided you wanted to devote sales tax dollars to make up for this property tax loss?
Again, I guess so in Michigan, you'd be looking at about a 140% increase in your existing sales tax rate, double it, and then 40% beyond that. I mean, that's a really, really high sales tax. And we know that affects behavior as well. It affects consumption patterns. You're going to consume less. It means that if you're anywhere near a border, you're probably going to engage in cross-border shopping. Now, we know that if you don't pay sales tax in another jurisdiction, theoretically you owe use tax. We also know people don't comply with that very well, and you don't really actually owe that if you just drive across the border. So businesses, I think, are going to suffer as people drive across the border to the degree they can't. They're paying just anomalously high sales tax rates. It's also, people think of the sales tax as a consumer tax, and it largely is, and it's supposed to be, but it's also a tax on business production because a little over 40% of the sales tax is actually remitted by businesses on their business purchases, not, the business just remitting on your behalf when you buy from them, but it's on their machinery and their equipment and all of these other things. And that's true in a lot of states. You raise those rates dramatically, and businesses are paying more to operate in Michigan than in any other state. And at that point, they have to start thinking, do I operate somewhere else? Because they can't charge that much more because they're selling in a national or international market. So out of state companies that aren't paying all that extra tax on their production can undersell them in Michigan and across the rest of the country. That's a huge disincentive to locate your business, to locate your operations in Michigan in a way that the property tax just doesn't have that same impact. Now, listen, I mean, every tax has some impact. Nothing's free in life. But the property tax introduces far fewer distortions than any of these other taxes. It's also distributing things across taxes. Again, not all eggs in one basket. If you put everything in any one of these taxes, you have a really uncompetitive tax code, a code that I think a lot of people are going to try to avoid in various ways.
Yeah, you also talked a little bit about local option sales tax. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we don't have a lot, we don't have any of that in Michigan. There might be some municipalities in Michigan, I'm not sure, that have that option, but I know no counties do in Michigan.
Yeah, that's not an option now, but anything I guess is part of a conversation. If we're at the point where we're talking about eliminating the property tax, which no one has ever done, I suppose what's not on the table, you could theoretically provide local authority, whether it's income or sales tax. A lot of states, 38 states, have some degree of local option sales tax, so that's not new. Usually we're talking about another point or two on the rate. Here, obviously, we're talking more like, I don't know, 10 points on the rate. We're not talking about small amounts. The bigger issue is that it varies dramatically from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I haven't run those particular numbers in Michigan, but I did run them in Florida. And I know very different state, but let me just use that as a point of comparison because Florida has some really good data to make this possible. Statewide in Florida, you need about a 15.3% sales tax rate, including the current plus the new, to eliminate their property tax. But if you did that on a county by county level, it would range from 9.8% to 32.5% based on which county it is. Because if you have a retail concentration or you've got a lot of tourism, you can raise a lot of revenue on your base. If you're an agricultural area, if you are a bedroom community, if there's just not a whole lot of retail activity going on in your jurisdiction, the rates necessary to offset that revenue are going to be ludicrously high. And that's before we think about cross-border shopping. I mean, it's one thing to talk about state cross-border shopping, but if it's 32% in your jurisdiction and it's 12 across the way, are you willing to drive a little for that differential? I think a lot of people will, and that drives up even more how much your jurisdiction would have to, generate on the sales tax, what rate that would require. It's again, I think, not practical at all.
Yeah, so those are a couple of the options. Were there any other options you guys looked at or talked about, or combinations of which?
Yeah, I mean, really, the combinations for elimination are going to be it's either income or sales tax, or I suppose both at either the state level with different allocative methods, none of which I think do well, or local authority to generate that. Each of those creates its own perverse incentives. They create, the different challenges for jurisdictions that have their hands tied, but also sort of principal agent problems. If nothing you do controls the amount of revenue that you generate, it just happens. In jurisdictions that receive a whole lot more, there's really no incentive for efficiencies. In jurisdictions that receive a whole lot less, there's no incentive to grow your economy. Those aren't things we want at the local level. And that local control question is really important. In some places, people want to pay more for higher quality of services. In other places, they may want to pay less. People don't love the property tax. Clearly, that's the case. But one of the great things is it's a really responsive tax. It's hugely transparent. People know what they paid last year. That's one reason why they don't love it. But I would ask people, what did you pay in sales tax last year? Do you have any clue whatsoever what you paid in sales tax last year? It's a good thing that you know what you paid in property tax and that you can think, am I getting my money's worth for the services I receive? And if you don't, that's a local thing. You can go to your local elected officials, you can go to local meetings, and you can petition. You can be involved in that process. You really can't do that if the state's assuming that authority. So, whatever replacement, I think it's worse from an economic growth standpoint. It's worse from the incentive structure it creates for local and state governments. It creates huge challenges for jurisdictions that have bonded based on certain revenue assumptions that no longer have that. And fundamentally, as unpopular as the property tax can be with some people, it's a tax that really corresponds reasonably well to the benefits you're receiving. It makes sense as a tax. That's why it's economically efficient. It's not perfect. We can always talk about ways to make it better. And I think in an environment where assessed values have risen rapidly and sometimes people are paying a lot more, those are conversations that are absolutely worth having. But it's about improving a system, not eliminating it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think Michigan's a little bit of a leader in that area where we do have a cap on how fast property taxes can grow in Michigan
Yep.
compared to some other states that are uncapped, and I think that's where you're seeing
Yep.
a lot of action in this space. So this report's on taxfoundation.org. You mentioned you guys do a lot of other tax research. What other maybe projects have you guys worked on that may be interested to county government?
Well, at the county level, we've worked on a lot of things with, again, local sales tax, which is not really an issue in Michigan.
Yeah.
We've done other things on property tax, on local income taxes, which is really just a Detroit issue in Michigan. But we have a wide range of resources on taxes at all levels of government and the ways that state and local taxes interact. So, hope people who are interested will go to taxfoundation.org, take a look.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jared. Anything else you want to touch on before we sign off?
Just that, no tax is perfect. No one's going to love any tax. Something's kind of wrong with you if you absolutely love paying taxes, but we do have to pay for the services we receive. And the property tax connects those benefits better than almost any other tax so that you can actually answer the question for yourself. Is this the appropriate level? and then go to your government officials. You're not going to do that with a state income tax, a state sales tax. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, would basically be my conclusion here.
Yeah, without significant increases in either one of those other taxes, there's no way to make up that shortfall. So that's the key point there. So thank you, Jared, for your time today. Great report, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.